Oh, hello, everyone, and welcome back to Angela Carter, a radical prescience. To give it the question mark it requires. I'm Naomi Foyle, and it's my wonderful honor to introduce our second keynote speaker, Sarah Gamble, a trailblazer, pathfinder, and constant gardener in the fecund field of Angela Carter studies. Sarah Gamble is Associate Professor in the Department of English and Creative Writing at Swansea University. She is the author of the first full-length monograph on Angela Carter's work, Angela Carter, Writing from the Frontline, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 1997. In 2004, Sarah published Angela Carter, A Literary Life with Palgrave. She has also written numerous essays on various aspects of Carter's writing and is currently co-editing with Anna Watts a 2-volume essay collection on Carter's work for Bloomsbury Publishing, Angela Carter's Pasts, Allegories and Intertextualities, and Angela Carter's Futures, Representations, Adaptations, and Legacies. The paper she is giving today is a work in progress towards her next monograph, which will look at the influence of art on Carter's oeuvre. It's a great pleasure to welcome Sarah to deliver this paper, if not physically, then over the Teams waves, to a room garlanded with art influenced by Angela Carter.
Thank you very much indeed. It is a very strange feeling giving a paper over. Sorry, there's a really funny feedback going on.
Yeah.
I can hear myself twice.
Yeah, it's our fault.
Oh, thank you. It's just that there's a slight echo, which is a little bit off-putting. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event. I'm going to begin with a very short preamble because as I've been preparing for this paper, it's been a bright spot in a world at the present moment, which, what with pandemic and war, can seem overwhelmingly bleak. But Carter shows us, of course, in her work, how to face fortitude with both humour and defiance. We might think of Nora and Dora Chance in Carter's final novel, Wise Children, who were born, quote, on a day of sunshine and high wind when the Zeppelins were falling, who survive a Second World War, which was, as Dora admits, no picnic, but end the novel still proclaiming what a joy it is to dance and sing. Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery, declares Dora by way of Jane Austen. And while a carnival has got to stop sometime, Carter would tell us to enjoy it while it lasts. So I think this is what we need to do today to celebrate a wonderful community of scholars that has built up around the love of Carter's work and its study. So the title of my paper today is Angela Carter's Artist Assassins, Assemblage, Collage and the Politics of Recycling, which is a rather unwieldy title, I admit. But of course, you always come up with the title. You're always asked for the title of your paper before you actually write it. So yeah, it's a nice broad umbrella title for a paper that at the time I devised it was not yet written. But I hope you think it's worked out okay. So this symposium invites us to think about Carter's continuing relevance 30 years after her death to the contemporary, and recycling is necessarily a central tenet of our times. As Gillian Whiteley asserts in her book Junk, Art and the Politics of Trash, trash has become the trope of the turn of the 21st century. Now, I'm certainly not going to be saying that Carter's work is trash, because you'd pull the plug on me pretty quickly if I did. But I'm going to be arguing that it's something in which she's enduringly interested. And I really don't have time to look at all the different modulations of her interest in trash in her work. But I'm going to, in this paper, focus on looking at Carter's work as a type of trash art, and explore her presentation of certain figures who, I argue, function as trash artists, and explore I want to argue that although this can be traced back to Angela Carter's interest in surrealism, and my co-editor in the forthcoming Bloomsbury collection, of course, is the authority on that, Anna Watts, but her interest in trash can also track forward to connect with our own obsessions concerning rubbish, waste, and detritus of all kinds. Where do we draw the line between what is useful and what is waste? What do we do with what we discard? Can its use value be reinstated? And if so, how? These are questions that I would argue Carter often poses in her work, although, in typical Carter fashion, the direction in which she takes these inquiries are often disconcerting, since she plays out the debate on and through the dead bodies of women, thus taking it into the realm of gender politics. And although I don't have time to consider it, perhaps we can see her anticipating contemporary movements like the Me Too movement. Before I launch into my lecture proper, though, I'd like to begin with a disclaimer, stressing I'm a bit like Caleb, in that what I'm going to be discussing is very much a work in progress, part of what is eventually intended to be a monograph-length study of the influence of visual art on Carter's writing. Hence, there are many aspects of this topic that I haven't yet fully explored. Moreover, because I've only got around 45 minutes, I necessarily have to present my argument in broad strokes, and this involves flattening out the intricacies of the relationship between different forms of art that makes use of fragments and waste. In this paper, I will specifically concentrate on the movement known as pop art, which was at its height when Carter began her career, and which often made use of recycled or reworked materials in order to create artworks that challenged the division between high and low culture and challenge traditional notions of cultural value. My argument is strengthened by the fact that Carter was not averse to placing herself in this category either, particularly early in her career. Even before the publication of her first novel, when she still had poetic ambitions, she described her poetry as a kind of pop poetry, with images from Ian Fleming, off the back of cornflake packets, women's magazines, strip cartoons, etc. And in private correspondence, she also repeatedly referred to Shadow Dance, her first novel, as her pop art novel. So it's clear that particularly early in her career, she had pop art in mind when she was writing her poetry, and certainly at least Shadow Dance. But I'm going to be arguing that that influence of pop art continues beyond the first novel. When thinking about Carter herself as a narrative pop artist, however, we encounter a conundrum when it comes to her use of trash or waste. On the one hand, as an author, she could be viewed as performing the role of the Baudelairean chiffonnier, the rag picker who accumulates what society discards. And Walter Benjamin allied this figure with that of the poet, who, he said, and I quote, finds the refuse of society on their street and derive their heroic subject from this very refuse. If we think about Carter in this context, we can view her as a practitioner of assemblage or collage, bringing disparate pieces of discarded material together to form an artistic whole. And as her career progressed, she of course became an accomplished bricoleur, constructing her idiosyncratic and inventive narratives out of allusions to bits and pieces of other narratives, genres and modes, both high and low, sacred and profane. Now this latter point, the fact that she draws on high as well as low modes, she draws on the sacred as well as the profane, means that it could, on the other hand, be argued that many of the pieces she uses in her narrative assemblages are not waste at all, but fragments of what society actually most values. In other words, rather than scavenging in junkyards, she goes into culture's most holy places and smashes them up in order to create her art from their fragments. After all, there is no question that destruction is at the heart of her practice. I mean, I think another direction I could go in is to think of her as a kind of destruction artist. As she says in her essay Notes from the Front Line, and this quotation has already been cited several times today, "I'm all for putting new wine in old bottles, especially if the pressure of the new wine makes the old bottles explode." She adored desecration and iconoclasm, as evidenced by her swan song, the film The Holy Family Album, which is a highly surreal and gleefully offensive piece of visual art that presents Jesus as the abused child of God the Father. It's a project that in itself recalls pop art's function in the post-war period, during which it helped to construct, quote, "a new democratic model of culture which broke down the old hierarchies of taste and constructed a new collage culture from the fragments of the old." That's Robert Hewison speaking here, but I think it really speaks to what Carter is about, breaking down old hierarchies and creating a new collage culture from the fragments of the old. So as we shall see, any discussion of Carter's work as creative recycling presents us with a conundrum from the outset, since she is as likely to create waste as she is to curate it. In the words of the Canadian geographer David Ley, for the Baudelairean poet Scavenger, quote, "the reconfiguration of matter involves also the reconfiguration of meaning. An act of transformation has converted junk to valued products." But in the context of Carter's art, this statement is only partially true. For while she certainly does reconfigure meaning in the linguistic collages, the referential collages that she constructs, she does not necessarily convert junk to valued products. Instead, she is as likely to disturbingly reiterate its status as junk, as waste, as inherently valueless. This dialectic tension between waste and value in her work is what brings me to the exploration of the recurring figure in Carter's novels and short stories that I term in my paper's title, the artist assassin. Her early publications in particular feature male figures who are amateur practitioners of trash art or found object art. Anna Watts, as I've already intimated, has persuasively explored the influence of the surrealists on Carter's writing, and it is true that many of the surrealists made use of waste products in their work as part of their project to dismantle the division between art and not art. So we might think, for example, of Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. These are objects which they're objects that have been mass-produced, but he plays with them in placing them in art galleries, thus changing their value. They become not everyday objects, but art. So that's one example of the way that the surrealists play around with found objects or objects that are denoted as possessing no value. We might also think about Hans Bellmer's very disturbing dolls, which he constructed out of prosthetic parts. And I think that, again, Anna has talked about Hans Bellmer's dolls in relation in particular to shadow dance. But these are examples of the way in which surrealists played around with valueless items and reallocated value to them in their art. But I want to argue that Carter's artist assassins need not be read or only be read. I'm not throwing Anna's arguments out. Carter was absolutely influenced by the surrealists, but I do want to argue that we can also read her early work in particular as expressions of what was going on in British and American art at the time these works were written in the 60s. Andy Warhol, maybe, or Richard Hamilton, whose 1956 exhibition at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, called This Is Tomorrow, came to be considered a defining moment for pop art in Britain. It is absolutely striking how many of the male antagonists in her early work are makers of one kind or another. Honeybuzzard in Shadow Dance makes jumping jacks, and Uncle Philip in the Magic Toy Shop crafts intricate wooden puppets, while Dr. Hoffman's desire machines supplant reality with surrealism. And I will be arguing in a little while that even the Marquis in the Bloody Chamber can be regarded as a kind of artist who curates his castle to become one enormous art gallery. However, Carter's depiction of these figures demonstrate that she had her differences with pop art, just as she had with surrealism, and on the same grounds. In her essay Alchemy of the Word, which is her essay about surrealism, she claimed that she got, and I'm quoting now, she got bored with it and wandered away. And this was once she, quote, realised that surrealist art did not recognise I had my own rights to liberty and love and vision as an autonomous being, not as a projected image. Figures like Warhol and Hamilton may have been innovators, but both actually still retained very traditional approaches to the figure of the woman in art. Richard Hamilton echoed generations of traditional artists when he once said that, quote, he was never so fulfilled as when drawing or painting from the naked female body, the most beautiful subject for art. And we can see, this is just one example. This is his painting, which he created in 1957, and it's called Hommage à Chrysler Corps. And what it does is it merges the sexualized female body, the naked sexualized female body, with that of a car. And although I suppose you can argue that this is done with critique in mind, it is also, of course, very voyeuristic. It is a study of commodification and desire. A car like a woman like a car are idealized objects that men desire, and they exist to be viewed and desired by men. And Andy Warhol, of course, I'm sure you all have his Marilyn Monroe pictures in mind. You know, he famously played with stereotypes of femininity, and we're very familiar with his fascination with iconic and tragic female cultural figures like Marilyn Monroe. But undoubtedly the most disturbing of his works is the not so famous, or at least not so famous to me, some of you may have a greater knowledge of pop art than I do, but this is a not so famous work called Suicide Fallen Body, which he created in 1962, and it's part of his series called Death and Disaster. And what it is, it's not very clear here, and perhaps it's just as well that it's not. It's a multiple reproduction of a notorious photograph taken on the 1st of May 1947, when a young woman called Evelyn McHale jumped off the Empire State Building. A photographer called Richard Wiles, who just happened to be nearby at the time by pure chance, took a picture of her strangely unmarked body, which had smashed onto the roof of a parked car. The resulting image, termed the most beautiful suicide, became famous, and particularly as it's now viewable on the internet, has been seen by millions. I've made the choice actually not to show the photograph because I am critiquing that voyeurism, or that surrounds, that voyeuristic impulse that surrounds dead, beautiful female bodies. You can find it on the internet very easily. Just type Evelyn McHale into a search engine and you'll find the photograph. But I chose not to show it here, out of respect to her. And what Warhol does is he takes that image and he reproduces it multiple times. But I don't think that it does anything to mitigate the problematic nature of the image in the first place. In fact, I think it gets its force from that very problematic, those problematic illusions. And we see echoes of this fascination and critiques, as I will go on to argue, of this fascination with the passive, exploited, commodified female body in the works of Carter's artist assassins, all of whom, one way or another, take the female form as the raw material for their creations. And I want to go on to focus on two such figures in particular, both of whom literalize this act of artistic appropriation in the most grotesque and disturbing of ways. While Hamilton and Warhol play with images of the female body, both Honeybuzzard in Shadow Dance and the Marquis in the short story The Bloody Chamber use the real thing as their raw material. They literally make their art out of corpses. And in doing so, illuminate the murderous misogyny that lies at the root of male artists' perennial obsession with women's dead bodies. And here's some examples. I mean, these have been, they may well be familiar to you. So, for example, Ophelia. Ophelia was a hugely popular subject for 19th century artists in particular. There are so many pictures of Ophelia. And of course, why is Ophelia so fascinating? Because she is doomed, because she dies. And here is just one example of many, and probably one of the most famous, John Everett Millais' picture, Ophelia. And there she is with her long hair flowing about her, floating down the stream, her eyes turned up to the sky, looking beautiful, melancholic, and very dead. And the Lady of Shalott from Tennyson's poem, the Lady of Shalott, who of course, you know, is in a castle under a curse, spies Sir Lancelot, falls instantly in love with him. And when she turns around to look out of the window of her tower, she activates the curse. So she goes down to the river, lies on her death barge, sings while she dies, and floats down the river to Camelot. By the time she gets there, she is again a beautiful corpse. And Sir Lancelot can only look at her body and remark on how lovely her face is. And again, this is a perennial subject for 19th century male artists. And here's, again, just one example of many where you've got the body, the flowing hair. You can see the similarity, the iconographic similarity here, and the way in which she is transformed into an object to be looked at. She cannot look anymore, she's dead, but she has been turned into art. She is something to be surveyed by anyone who cares to look at her. So we have women who have died for love. We also have quite a strong subgenre in the 19th century of female bodies on anatomist tables. And I've given you two examples here, both of which I think are equally disturbing. There's Enrique Simonet, La Autopsia, painted in 1890, and Gabrielle von Max's The Anatomist from 1869. And I think, you know, you can see again the similarity between these pictures and the romanticized pictures of the Lady of Shalott and Ophelia that I showed you on the last slide. You know, again, their death is the ultimate passivity. They can do nothing to baffle the male gaze. And I think both of these pictures are incredibly disturbing. Here, the anatomist has actually literally ripped the woman's heart out of her chest and is contemplating it. So you've got this really bizarre mixture of kind of body horror and romance. And I think the illusion is clear. Again, this is a woman who has died for love. And the anatomist is pondering the mysteries of the female heart that he holds quite literally in his hands. And I always think that von Max's picture is really creepy, because I can never decide whether that sheet that is over the naked body, because both of these women, of course, are naked, whether he's going to pull it down or whether he's going to pull it up. And, you know, there's something really, I think, creepy about that painting. So, you know, you can have romanticized images, you can have anatomy images, but in every one, the woman is presented as perfected in death. It is in death that she reaches the height of her beauty and completes her destiny, which is to be looked at by men, because after all, isn't that what every woman should desire? As Elizabeth Bronfen argues, both death and femininity are created as images. Death turns the woman into an object of sight. And apart from the Ophelia image that I showed you on the previous slide, all of these pictures not only show the dead body of the woman, but the dead body of the woman being looked at. And that's important. And in this context, and I don't want to disturb you too much, but I find this truly disturbing, that even in 2014, so less than 10 years ago, the image of Evelyn McHale, which I've already talked about, which Warhol used in his artwork, was read in exactly the same way by the journalist Ben Cosgrove, who wrote in Time magazine, quote, "In Wiles's photo, Evelyn, it doesn't feel right to refer to her as Ms. McHale, looks for all the world as if she's resting or napping, rather than lying dead amid shattered glass and twisted steel. Everything about her pose, her gloved hand clutching her necklace, her gently crossed ankles, her right hand with its gracefully curved fingers, suggests that she is momentarily quiet, perhaps thinking of her plans for later in the day, or daydreaming of her beau." I would remind you that this was written in 2014. And notice the presumption of familiarity in the author's use of the first person. His detailed, even lascivious description of the pose of the corpse, and the facetious statement that she looks as if she might be daydreaming of her beau. In fact, Evelyn McHale's suicide note, which is not mentioned in this article, made it clear that she was motivated to jump by her reluctance to go ahead with marrying her fiancé. But for viewers of this most beautiful suicide, Evelyn McHale the person doesn't matter. What's important is her image, which can be loaded with whatever meaning they choose to impose on it. She can't contradict them, after all. Cosgrove's treatment of Evelyn McHale upholds Catherine McCormack's statement that, quote, "The horizontal bodies of maidens line our art galleries, and their influence ripples through fashion photography and advertising that glamorizes sexual violence towards women and aestheticizes their subordination and despair." McHale's photograph can be situated in a disturbingly long iconographic tradition of women for whom love and death are inextricable, and their corpses configured as waste matter, which can be transformed into the objects of romantic, even erotic contemplation. A young dead woman can be transmuted into a male image of feminine perfection who will never age, never protest, never become undesirable, her passivity guaranteed. The necrophiliac obsession that saturates such images is obscured because it elides into aesthetic manipulation of the beauty of the female form immortalized in death. Now, what Carter does in novels such as Shadow Dance is to remind us of the pure horror underlying this artistic tradition, one which persists, as we have seen, into the 20th century and the work of the pop art movement. While not a professional artist per se, Honeybuzzard, the owner of a junk shop containing items scavenged from bombed out houses, arranges his merchandise to create what is effectively a contemporary art gallery. For example, quote, "The statue of a broken naked boy with a fierce dog beside him. The boy already wore a brocaded hat, part of the dress uniform of an Edwardian military gentleman. The boy also wore a false nose. At the foot of the garden boy, 5 black and gold tins, each with an elaborate and incomprehensible Chinese character on its belly, congregated mutely. Behind his head, pinned on the wall, was a black kimono with many coupling dragons embroidered on the crackling silk. And that was one corner of the shop only. So what Honey has created here is effectively an art installation. He has accumulated what has been broken and discarded and put it together in a new and striking combination that, though ridiculous, I mean, the boy wears a false nose, also gives it a purpose, or a new purpose, as a recycled commodity. Now, Vergine states that, quote, trash is a commemoration of that which satisfied our needs or satiated our desires. And this is endorsed in the most literal of ways in Shadow Dance. Honey's last and greatest work of art is purely private, one he creates in the middle of the night in a derelict house out of the murdered body of his former girlfriend, Ghislaine. Surrounded by dozens of candles, she is laid out on a trestle table, on her back, quote, with her hands crossed on her breasts so that her nipples poked between her fingers. Her eyes were shut down with pennies, 2 on each eyelid, and her mouth gaped open a little. And I think the resemblance between that tableau and these is quite striking. Awful though this scene is, the Ghislaine we see at this moment is still a work in progress. Honey's friend and business partner, Morris, spies on Honey, retrieving a crucifix and taking it into the room where Ghislaine lies. It's probably just as well that we do not know, and we never learn, precisely how he intends to incorporate it into his latest and last assemblage piece. Such a scene also clarifies Carter's intention to conflate the female body and waste, in that Ghislaine only becomes the subject of Honey's artistic endeavours because she is already trash and thus ripe for appropriation. Andy Warhol once said that, quote, I like to work on leftovers, doing the leftover things that were discarded, that everyone knew was no good. And this sentiment can be applied to Honey Buzzard, who is similarly drawn to what is already derelict and discarded. Ghislaine walks into the novel already ruined because she bears the mark of a previous encounter with Honey, which already brands her as leftover and broken. And this is a quotation. The scar went all the way down her face, from the corner of her left eyebrow, down, 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 past nose and mouth and chin, until it disappeared below the collar of her shirt. The flesh was marked with purple imprints from the stitches she had had in it. The scar had somehow puckered all the flesh around it, as if some clumsy amateur dressmaker had roughly cobbled up the seam and pushed her away, saying, I suppose it will do. Now, Ghislaine's shattered beauty, that's what Morris says about her, that she possesses her shattered beauty, can be linked to the image of the broken, naked boy in the junk shop. In both cases, their damage, the fact that they are no longer aesthetically pleasing, they have been split open or chipped or smashed, makes them refuse to be discarded. And thus, in this way, they become material to be recycled into an artwork. In The Bloody Chamber, Carter's version of Charles Perrault's Bluebeard tale, we meet another version of the artist assassin in the figure of the Marquis, a multiple murderer of beautiful women. And I'm presuming that you're all familiar with the story of Bluebeard, the multiple wife killer who marries, he's very wealthy, he marries a young girl, and she knows that he's been married many times before. He then, after their wedding, he then goes on a journey, but leaves her with all the keys to all the rooms in the castle, but carefully identifies one key as the one that she must not use. And of course she uses it, and she goes into the forbidden room to find the dead bodies of his former wives. And when he returns, he discovers her disobedience and prepares to murder her. But in Perrault's version of the story, and as I will be going into, there are several different versions of the same basic story, she is saved by her brothers, who rescue her and kill Bluebeard. Now, the point of the story, of course, is that Bluebeard has ensured that his wife never had any real choice. He intended to kill her all along. And this is an aspect of the tale that is heavily stressed in Carter's version, where his bride is surrounded by intimations of her fate from his gift of a, quote, choker of rubies 2 inches wide, like an extraordinarily precious slit throat, to the, quote, early Flemish primitive of St. Cecilia at her celestial organ, hanging on the wall of the music room. The bride does not stop to consider, or else does not know, that St. Cecilia was martyred by beheading, the very fate the Marquis has planned for her. But as this neurotically careful stage setting shows, the point for the Marquis is not the murder itself, but the aesthetic transformation of the bodies of his wives who come to his castle already effectively an artwork in progress. When the narrator, as she is bound to do, enters the bloody chamber, her first impression is rather surprising, since it is not bloody at all. Rather, it is a private art gallery in which the artist exhibits his most treasured works. Quote, the opera singer lay quite naked under a thin sheet of very rare and precious linen. I touched her very gently on the white breast. She was cool. He had embalmed her. On her throat, I could see the blue imprint of his strangler's fingers. The cool, sad flame of the candles flickered on her white closed eyelids. The worst thing was, the dead lips smiled. The resemblance to Carter's description of Ghislaine's body in Shadow Dance is notable. It's a more skillful execution of effectively the same work. Like Evelyn McHale and her sisters, the violence of the opera singer's death is obscured by aesthetics, as she is transformed into an object of contemplation rather than horror. The same goes for the second exhibit the narrator encounters, a, quote, skull hung up by a system of unseen cords so that it appeared to hang disembodied in the still heavy air, and it had been crowned with a wreath of white roses and a veil of lace, the final image of his bride. This isn't the work of a frenzied psychopath, but of an artist who carefully creates and curates objects of beauty, or at least his idea of beauty, out of the raw material of his brides. I've already said that Ghislaine becomes vulnerable to being used as trash because of the prior destruction of her desirability through physical ruination. And although the women in the bloody chamber might not be scarred in the same way, indeed, they are all noted beauties. In this case, it is their curiosity that causes them to cross the boundary that divides a value object from rubbish. Once they fall victim to this classically female vice, they no longer matter because they are matter. Nothing but trash that can be reworked into the artist assassin's ideal of the feminine. As Laura Mulvey states in Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, in a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female form, which is stylized accordingly. In their traditional exhibitionist role, women are simultaneously looked at and displayed. For the Marquis, his perfect women are bloodless and ethereal, their bodies frozen into the perfect whiteness of bleached bone and embalmed flesh. In Carter's story, the narrator is made aware of the inevitability of her fate when the hitherto unbloody chamber springs one last gruesome surprise. Alerted by a ghostly twang emanating from the Iron Maiden at the back of the room, she opens the door to find the body of the third wife, pierced by not 1 but 100 spikes. This body has yet to be perfected. At the moment of her discovery, she is nothing but a gory corpse. As the third wife's blood flows across the floor, the narrator becomes alert to the fact that she too is now marked as waste, destined to be reassembled into an artwork under her husband's hands. And when the Marquis retrieves the bloody key and presses it to her forehead, he indeed brands her as trash, something that is only worth discarding. But while the bloody body in the Iron Maiden is all part of Bluebeard's strategy, it could also be argued that the opening of its door also marks an entry point into realization and hence critique. In this light, it can be seen as a significant narrative move on Carter's part, because it is here that she makes explicit what was only implicit in Shadow Dance, that such art is only made possible through violence. Carter published her short story collection, The Bloody Chamber, in 1979, and at around the same time, a new American artist began to rise to prominence, whose preoccupations, I would argue, would come to overlap with Carter's own. Cindy Sherman is now famous for her photographs in which she creates and manipulates the female image, simultaneously evoking and subverting cultural modes of looking at women. In 1992, Sherman created her own version of the Bluebeard tale, although she draws on a German variation of Perrault's French source called Fitcher's Bird. Designed to look at first glance like a children's picture book, this publication is actually a photographic project with Sherman's images forming the illustrations for the text. The figures in these photographs are reminiscent of Belmer's dolls in that they are created out of fragments of medical prosthetics, wigs and masks, and thus they evoke both surrealism's and pop art's use of found objects. Sherman's work in Fitcher's Bird, and indeed in her art in general, resembles Carter's in its unflinching examination of the bloody chamber of art. The moment in Carter's tale where the protagonist opens the Iron Maiden and Bluebeard's chamber floods with blood confronts the reader spectator with that which the assassin artist usually conceals, that trash or assemblage art which takes the female body as its focus is founded in disgust. However stylized, however titillatingly veiled, however apparently reverential such works may be, they cannot be made without utilizing the female body as raw material, as an object to be manipulated rather than as a subject to be accommodated. Carter has lifted the image of the beautified female skull from Fitcher's Bird, as it does not feature in Perrault's version of the tale. So it appears in Sherman's artistic adaptation too. But I would argue that there's a significant difference between the two images. In Carter's narrative, the skull exists as pure art object, completely abstracted from the body. But Sherman's photograph shows us a more grotesque image. No amount of floral decorations can disguise this yellowed and gaping image of death. As Maria Tartar argues, art needs bodies, and Sherman's photographs for Fitcher's Bird show us how art uses dead bodies and dead body parts to create beauty. Defying the aestheticization of death in the wizard's art and refusing to concede that death is the mother of beauty, Sherman makes a mockery of efforts to dress up death in the photograph of a skull embellished with flowers and jewels by Fitcher's bride. Tartar's statement also draws attention to an important difference between Fitcher's Bird and Bluebeard. The heroine of Fitcher's Bird is far more resourceful than Perrault's heroine, and she decorates the skull herself, placing it in the attic window as a decoy bride while she escapes from Fitcher's house. The art object, in other words, has become the artist, echoing the way in which both Carter and Sherman devote their art to confronting and uncovering the misogyny that classifies women as nothing but waste matter that can only gain cultural value when recycled by men.
Sorry, Sarah, 1 more minute. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just on my final paragraph.
I thought you were sorry.
At the beginning of this paper, I said that when it comes to waste, Carter poses certain important questions regarding how rubbish is both identified and disposed of. I have argued that she addresses these issues through her presentation of the female body as material for art. When a woman is too curious or not pretty enough or fails to conform in any way to masculine ideals of femininity, then she becomes disposable, trash that can be thrown out, retrieved and recycled by the male artist, who then recreates woman as he wants her to be. As a writer who herself functions as a kind of assemblage artist, since she builds her narratives out of allusions to all kinds of genres, forms and modes, Carter takes the role of creator out of male hands, and in her trash art allusions shows her readers the profanity that lies behind that which is presented to us as sacred. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, so much. I think due to our timetable, we're going to take questions for you after the next panel. Sorry,
That's
let's
fine.
push them all together. So the next panel is going to be chaired by Ben, who's one of my MA students.
Right, so how does this work?
It's working, it's working all the time.
Oh, right.
Don't press anything.
I press something. It's now flashing red.
Can you hear it?
It's flashing red and it is pressed.
Yes. Right, so now.
Okay, now it's flashing.
Right. Hello. So my name is Ben Gaia, and I'm chairing the creative panel. We're very lucky to have so many talented artists and writers responding to Carter's work. So we have three speakers: Heidi Dahlsveen, Brenda Tolian, and Jess Richards, plus two artists, Vanessa Marr and Dagmara Rudkin, who aren't presenting papers, but will be available for the Q&A at the end. Heather, how does this work? Do the two artists talk briefly about their pieces at the start, or do I move right on to the speakers?
Yeah, we'll move on to Heidi and we'll do all the questions at the end with
Right.
the artist.
So Heidi is presenting Fragility, a performance, and she's worked as a storyteller since 1996, both nationally and abroad. She is associate professor at Oslo Metropolitan University in Norway. In 2008, she published the book Introduction to Oral Storytelling, and another book in 2019. Her specialism is letting the traditional narratives shed light on contemporary problems. Right?
Thanks, Heidi. So, Ben, if you pass yours, yeah.
Thank you, Ben. Wonderful. I hope this is working. If not, let someone knows. Let us see how I can attach this microphone to something. That's what I'm trying to. I try to put it on this one, because if it hangs on my neck, it will make all this noise. Okay, I think it's there. Wonderful, thank you. What is a good life? To understand what a good life is, you must understand vulnerability. Take scars, for instance. We all have a scar. Our first scar we do not remember. It is our navel. A Jewish story says that we have another scar in common. The story tells that when we were born with all the wisdom of the world. But as we were born, we were eager to say this. We opened our mouth, but then an angel was there putting her or his heavenly heavy index finger over our mouth, saying shh, and we forgot everything. But still under our nose, we have the mark of the angel finger. Of course, the most tragic scar story is the story about Oedipus, when the old nurse discovers the scars he has on his feet as she washes his feet, and she realized that the prediction came through. He has married his mother and killed his father. And then you have the story about her, she who is divided into two. I am going to present for you fragments of an already fragmented performance. In the performance, I have one folk tale carrying the performance, a Danish folk tale, but I will not tell you the whole story. It takes too much time because it takes 50 minutes to tell the folk tale. But I will tell you pieces of it. And I use the folk tale, the motives from the folk tale, to sort of intertextually go into memories, both autobiographical memories and collective memories. You were not seen. You who are half. You did not walk in the warm sand. You did not swim in the salt sea. Imagine a river. It's like a blue thread lost on a blue-green carpet. Some places the river is wide, other places it is very narrow, so narrow that you could just step over it. On one side of the river there was a forest where the trees were standing close. On the other side of the river the houses were standing close. Through the city there was a street, and at the end of the city there was a castle. In the castle a king and queen were sitting side by side. The queen, she was wise, she was beautiful, and they were happy, and the happiness perfect. The day the queen was pregnant, and 9 months later she gave birth to a child. But the child, the daughter, was born with an umbilical cord around her neck. And the king, he stepped forward, but the midwife pushed him aside, ran forward, loosened it, cut the string between the mother and the child, and then she slapped carefully the child on his back, and the child started to cry. And everybody sighed of relief, and in this, they forgot the queen, who was bleeding ill, and 3 days later, and what is 3 days later? I mean, time is a mental construction. How many nights are there in 3 days later? When I was born, there were 3 nuns present. Yes, I was born in a small city in Norway, and nuns were common during the birth, and 3 days later, because my father was not present, 3 days later, he wrote in his diary, I had a daughter, they say. I do not believe she is mine. The queen died, and the king, he traveled into the world to find a new queen. Meanwhile, the girl, the daughter, she grew up to a young woman, and one day, as she walked through the castle, she came to a closed chamber. She stepped into the chamber, And there, inside, she saw dresses hanging along the wall. And she, of course, like any young woman, she immediately tried out the dresses, pretending that she was a queen. And the king, he returned back home. And the king, he walked through the castle. And the king, he heard sounds from one of the closed chambers, the chambers belonging to his old queen. He opened it carefully, and there inside he saw his daughter. He saw how she tried one of the dresses. He saw how she was standing in front of the mirror. He saw her bare chest. The way I work with folktales is like Nicolas Bourriot talks about montages. He says that our reality today is montages. We have temporality understanding of the reality. And this is also the way I build up a performance, jumping here and there based on associations and memories and thoughts and theories. The king, he opened the door and he went inside and he said, "It is you, my daughter. It is you who is going to be my queen." Father, it's not possible. A father cannot marry his daughter. I am the king and I say what is possible. But Father, it is against the law. I am the king and I decide what the law is. But Father, it is against the nature. But daughter, can't you see it's raining on me? Can't you see me making things grow up from the soil? I control the animals. I am the nature, and I decide that you, my daughter, will be my queen. And no matter how she cried, and no matter how she asked and begged, the king said no. And she decided to never cry again. And she decided to escape. So that night, she took her nightingale, she made a knot, she took a knife and put it into the knot. She opened the window, she jumped out of the window, and then she ran towards the woods because she knew that there in the woods she would be safe. She escaped. My very first memory is from, I remember a room, a kitchen, and the walls in the kitchen is, I don't know how you call it in English. It's a mixture of blue and green turquoise, something like that called in English. I'm sitting in a big drawer. I'm sitting there pretending it is a boat. But right now, I'm sitting there holding my ears, closing my eyes, surrounding myself with the darkness. But despite the darkness, I can hear him. I hear how he is furious. I hear how he hit her towards the walls. I hear how he hit her. We escaped. And she escaped. And the king, he sent his 2 hunting dogs after her, and she ran. And she ran, and she felt, and she sensed, and she heard how the dogs were coming closer and closer. And she took the knife, and she cut off one of her breast, and she threw her breast over her shoulder. And then she continued to run, and the dogs threw themselves over the breast. And she ran, and she felt, and she heard how the dogs were coming closer and closer. And she took the knife, and she cut off the other breast, threw it over her shoulder, ran over the river into the wood, and she was safe in the wood. You know, Loke, the trickster from Norse mythology, one day he left the land of the gods. He went far, far away into the land of the giants, into a forest, and there, among the tall trees, he saw someone coming towards him with long, long legs. Someone coming towards him with huge, big breasts, completely naked, a giantess. She walked straight up to Loke, and she was taller than him. So Loke, he looked straight into her, and she grabbed Loke in her strong arms and she said, "I've been waiting for you." And then she kissed him, and her name was Angerboda, which means "you will regret this." And immediately they started, you know what I mean, down on the ground, up along the trunks of the trees, here and there, in and out, until Loke got tired and he wanted to leave. And Angerboda said, "Hey you, what about the children?" "The children?" Loke said. Yes, this endless activity had resulted in 3 children. And Angerboda said, "I'm a modern woman. I do not take care of it. I have a forest business to run. You being the father, you take care of the children." So Loke, he had to take his 3 children and bring them back to the land of the gods. And the first child was a serpent. A small one, but it grew fast. And soon it was so big that the gods stumbled in the serpent. And Thor, you know, Thor with a hammer, he grabbed the serpent and he threw the serpent into the air. And he flew into the air and splashed into the ocean. And there he continued to grow until he had surrounded the whole world, until he grabbed his own tail in his own mouth. Midgardsormen it is called. And there it's lying, keeping the world together. If he ever let go, the world will collapse. Land will sink, water will rise, and you have to find a new place to live. The second child, a wolf growing fast. The wolf wanted to swallow the moon, but the gods had to tie it in a place where he never could reach the moon, and they used a rope so strong that the wolf could not get loose. A rope made of women's beard, a rope made of fish spat, or whatever you call it in English, a rope made of the breath of the fish, a rope made of the roots of the mountain. The third child, she who is half. It's funny that they call her hel, meaning whole. But maybe she is whole because she is half dead, half alive. She is the one. We are walking the long road to. She is the one, the ruler over the land of plenty and no visits. She is the ruler of a death. And in this performance, if you want to read the rest of the folk tale about this girl who is hunted by her father, you have to go to Danish folk tales collected by Evald Tang Christiansen, and the folk tale is called The Woman Who Became a Man. Thank you for listening.
Right, so our next speaker is Brenda Tolian. So, Brenda, hi. So you're reading Ballet's Ove. So Brenda is a Gothic horror writer from southern Colorado. She was a doctorate student in English at Murray State University. University, and she's a lead in the structure of dark fiction at Alchemy Writers Workshop in Denver, and she has signed a book deal with Raw Dog Screaming Press for her novel of linked stories, Blood Mountain. Over to you.
Thank you. Angela Carter inspires so much of my writing and actual academic study, as well at Murray State University and formerly at Regis State University. This story is, I'm not sure how much you can see it, is from the Jewish Book of Dead, or sorry, not the Jewish Book of Dead, the Jewish Book of Horror, that recently just came out. And it is a retelling of the Witch of Endor, who, of course, within Christian and Jewish text, told Saul of his impending doom. But she's not giving a lot of agency within that text. And so I found it inspiring with Angela Carter once saying, "It is because there are remarkable lies designed to make people unfree." She is well known for subverting stories that we have been telling for many, many years. And it is with that inspiration that I will read a little bit to you from Ba'alatov. In the night, the spirit spoke with hisses and gurgles like serpents wrapped around my head. I awoke covered in sweat, barely able to breathe, so afraid of what they would ask me to do. They whispered things over and over, crying out for understanding. There was never a choice in my action, only the act itself or madness. The gift of the Ishe Balatov was taboo, but if not sent by Elohim, then who? What other power could overtake a child in such a way? My grandmother said it was the power from Mishara, the Lady of the Serpent. She told me of this, forbidding me from saying the name out loud. Women were killed for less, and for us, death came slow, behind brick or below the soil. We were not magicians or conjurers, but unwitting necromancers with the ancient connection to the dead. They came pressing into our dreams at night with leathery bodies and wet tongues, speaking terrible truths mixed with lies. Through learning and practice, we understood discernment, but this took many years. Sometimes, the spirits of the dead kept us plunged deep in Sheol, neglecting our physical bodies. Eventually, we would awake starved, crawling with insects, our mouths full of teeth and stone. It was always the same. When we reached for nourishment, a bit of bread, a mouthful of water, they might leave us to recover, sensing, I suppose, our uselessness and death. They did not leave us for long, descending once more, filling our mouths until we opened our bodies wide, allowing them to push into us. The visions and words flowed like a river of thought, disjointed and disturbing. Sometimes the meaning escaped us, and the spirits grew irritable and angry. Other times they touched our minds like feathers. If ignored, they filled our mouths with stones, teeth, or berries, symbolizing their intruding thoughts and displeasure. We could not deny them when they did this, or they would replicate the objects until we choked. I have only observed it once in a child who did not know her gift. She was found with her purple cheeks stuffed bumpy with rocks and berries oozing down her chin, mixed with blood. The child did not know how to open herself. We had no choice but to obey. I was blessed to have a teacher in my grandmother. Even after the day, our kind were silenced on threat of death. The king did not understand that the gift could not be silenced or stopped. We did not call it down by dark means. It was imbued at conception, a heritage that would not be refused. Though we hid far above the towns we served, they still hunted us to near extinction. My grandmother took us deep into the highlands, continuing my education. But the king's men were jackals on a blood trail. She knew they would eventually find us. On that last day, I watched hidden as they shut my grandmother behind brick and rock, the men sitting on grim vigil until her scratching and screaming ceased. After they left, I waited, frightened to approach our home that sat empty and tomb-like. I tried to pull the bricks down, but one layer only revealed another. I sat for many days as the spirit spoke of her death, slowly cut off from light and then air. Behind that wall, I could not hear my grandmother, though I slept beside it for days. For 2 years, the spirits remained quiet, as they also feared the command of the king. I lived feral in my grief and the silence of this lost connection, until the night the spirits returned. In my dreams, I heard the first whispers beyond the wall, the sound crossing between worlds. I listened to her voice, angry and harsh within the sudden whirlwind of insect-like voices of the spirits. I awoke, my mouth forced open with gravel and berries, and I jammed my fingers behind the rocks, pushing them out so I could fill my lungs with air. Beyond, the voice filtered from the wall in its terrible words. I recognized that voice deep in my bones. I knew. My dreams continued for many days, vivid, awash in meat and blood, men screaming as a horrible horde of bronze washed over them with no end. This horde of thousands moved in iridescent swarms that entered every opening, funneling into the nose, mouth, eyes, and nether regions. I heard their clicking mandibles chewing through the bodies of men, their mouths so full of the horde that they could not scream. The men tore their clothing and skin in agony, crawling toward me, grasping the hem of my robe. The terrible cacophony would merge into my mouth, screaming, my eyes open. My body and face pressed upon the cool bricks. My breath the only sound after the terrible din of the dream. I closed my eyes, enjoying the quiet that blanketed my mind, seeking another sound altogether. I waited until I heard the scratching of nails, a terrible sound, yet a promise that she was also there with me. Sometimes during the day, they would come pushing into the corners of my mind. "He will come, and you will tell," they hissed, rolling a stone into my mouth. Clutching my head, I asked, "Who will come?" "He will come, and another will come through," they whispered, adding a berry with another stone. "What shall I do?" I pleaded, digging my fingers into my temples, seeking to dull the pain. "You will feed him," they laughed before vacating. I saw them 3 days later down in the valley, long before finding my cave, and I watched the dusty caravan creeping closer. Servants darted out to explore the many caverns below, looking for the Belatov. The spirits were strangely hushed and with their coming. I washed my body and anointed myself in precious oils. My hair I let fall to my waist in long dark circles. I remained a pure oracle, untouched by man, only invaded by spirits, a conduit of the unseen. We could copulate, but only to produce the next daughter. If sons were created, the spirits would come in the night and slip into our bellies. They would feed there for many days, ripping apart the child with tiny sharp teeth until the only blood poured out from the womb. The woman would share in the agony, our spirits in direct union with our young. This was the reason there were so few of us. We did not want to chance the sorrow of growing a son. I lived with many rules of purity. The laws of the Balatov were not so different from any oracle. Our body is treated as a sacred space. We relied on people seeking our power to provide. The people of Endor would climb to this cave, bringing food and textiles in trade for our words from the dead. They also brought news, especially of the king's men who hunted the Balatov by command of Elohim. Yet magic is only magic when pouring out of a woman's mouth. When I was ready, I left the cave and climbed to the high ridge. I felt the heavy presence of the spirits around me, but they hovered just out of reach. I started a fire, feeding it wood until it could easily be seen by those below. I wanted the man to know I expected him. I walked barefoot to the edge, my eyes sweeping the dun earth, the hills of Moria falling away to my left, and Mount Tabor to my right. I stood in a nameless place, high above Endor, with the Jezreel Valley cupped hands below. The caravan paused, and a man rode out to the front, and I could not see who he was, but my mouth began filling with small stones like smooth teeth. I knew he was the one the spirit spoke of. I turned the stones with my tongue, retreating to the fire, spitting them into the flames. I won't deny you. I did not know if I spoke to the spirits or to the man. I watched the man consult with his armored column, the metal shining under the dwindling sunlight, thousands of lights flickering in the valley to the southwest, a vast army waiting for battle. I sensed they were in opposition to the man who parted from the caravan. Alone he rode to the base of the ridge, glancing up, perhaps noticing the smoke of my fire. All around the air circulated in ropes of warmth and ice. Hushed whispers flowed, ancient voices in sing-song. Their words were dark and terrible, melting my knees and making my hands tremble. Something foreboding followed in the wake of that man. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And finally, we have Jess Richards. Yeah, Jess.
Hi.
Jess, hi.
Hello.
So while Heather sorts that stuff out, Dr. Jess Richards teaches creative writing at Massey University in New Zealand. She is the author of 3 novels, and had also published short fiction, creative non-fiction, and poetry. she will read from her short stories written for her PhD, which was a hybrid of fine art and fiction, completed in 2020.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Okay, I'm going to try and share a PowerPoint with you and do some reading along with it, interrupting myself all the way through. Hopefully, oops. Okay, can you see that and see me as well, or just see the screen?
Yes, we can see both.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, it was a real pleasure to be here. So yeah, I'm Jess Richards. I'm talking to you from New Zealand, where it's extremely early in the morning at the moment. So bear with me. Angela Carter writes third, second, and first person narratives and actively works with the tenses, as author and academic Marion May Campbell describes in her thorough intertextual analysis of the Bloody Chamber. According to Campbell, within Carter's short stories, the unconventional shifts from the preterite tense associated with the folk fairy tale to the immediacy of the present have a powerful effect. Carter describes her intention in retelling folkloric texts as not to do versions, but to extract the latent content from the traditional stories and to use it as the beginnings of new stories. The latent content is violently sexual. As writers who have had our fictional illusion disrupted by Carter, breaking conventional grammar and storytelling rules, we are prompted to reflect on our own storytelling and retellings. In this session, I will read from some of my short stories which explored present tense combined with first, second, and third person narrations in new stories which incorporated elements from European fairy tales. These were part of my creative practice PhD, which was a hybrid fine art and fiction writing project completed in 2020. It was titled Transformations, Illusions, and Iterations, Storytelling as Fiction, Image, and Artefact. And you should be able to see some of the images and the artifacts on the screen. I'm going to just read a few extracts from a couple of short stories. Actually, I'm going to read you a very short full one, which will be published shortly, hopefully in Grammarly. So I'm very excited about having that accepted. This one's called Skin, Stilt, Rumple, a Fairy Tale Dreamed Backwards. You cry after forever making a stranger of your baby. Half-sized in silhouette, a crumpled man enters through the barn door, carrying a baby in a cloth. The man is rumpled, stilts for legs, wrapped in skins. Arms outstretched, you collapse into blood-stained straw. Your dress rises above your thighs and bloods rush back into your body. You exhale the smell of the sea. The man places the baby between your bare thighs, saying, born first, and undemanding. The baby is pulled into your body. It clenches and curls head down inside your womb. The crumpled man walks backwards out of the barn as you stare at him in horror and swallows screams as your contractions are fast and violent, slow and then stop. You are soaked and then dry. You think of threads and the distortions of magic. The baby kicks. Your swollen belly flattens as the baby shrinks. Your breasts unswell. Your hip bones reshape and your body is thin. You long to name a fertilized egg in a glow of love before it splits and splits and splits. Your period doesn't come. You hide, ashamed. In a forest, half naked, you take lust from a disguised farmer against a stone wall. His sperm rushes away from your egg and he pushes and pulls until his body is separated from yours. Backing away from each other, you get dressed as you eye him with feral curiosity, which fades into fear as you startle each other. You break down the door of a barn which mends itself behind you and locks you inside. Through a crack in the door, you watch autumn leaves blow back up into the trees. Something shakes in the air, a feeling of wrong. Think of guesses, an impossible game. You regret all your attempts at choice. Your thoughts split hint from clue, puzzle from maze, key from lock. Final try, wrong, a second guess. You are clever, you know this. The first guess is wrong. Night after night, the crumpled man is with you. Through your dreams, you hear him suck in the words, name, my, guess. He hands you the spindle and is gone. From midnight back to dawn, you unravel strands of gold from the spindle till blood runs into the cuts on your fingers. Wiry threads soften into straw, which fills the barn with warmth. This is an impossible task. You are choked, unraveling, alone. A wind pulls away from the sky, and an old woman unlocks the barn door and steps inside. She removes the spell from the spindle, empties the straw out into the fields, and pushes you through a forest all the way to your childhood home. Tears roll into your parents' eyes as they embrace you. They throw gold coins into the hands of the old woman who disappears, leaving you staring at the thickening sky in anticipation. Inside the cottage, your mother and father sit by the fire, starving, poverty-stricken, and strained. You beg them for time. They explain to you that they are welcoming you home. You feel young, small as a child. You push yourself upon them and cry like a baby, at least once. I'm just going to read a short extract from the beginning of another story called Fragile. I've agreed to this curse of 7 years of silence, and until those years are over, my 6 brothers remain swans. I don't have to seal up my lips with the strands of hair they left in their combs, but all the same, 7 years, I might crack like some glass-made thing, spilling screams and curses of my own. What if my mind breaks? After all, aren't all sisters fragile? Or is that only what brothers think? But my skin is still warm, my lips still part to breathe, and I am full of hope. Tonight my heart sings with unspoken stories as I weave my hands through this cold northern wind. I kiss the sky as my swan brothers sleep indoors, snake necks tucked into white duvet wings. Breathing and gasping and sighing all this moonlight into myself. My hands pick thistledown from the edges of the road. What is it like to fly? An aeroplane passes over and my mouth blows the thistledown away. The swans go out all day and come home at night, seaweed scented, as if they've spent hours flying over salted oceans. They nudge at the pots and frying pans with their wingtips, jerk their heads in the directions of the cooker and microwave. They jump on the table, spread their wings, and pretend to be tablecloths. I don't like the sounds they make. They hiss like anger, and there's no rhythm to their stamping. They want me to serve feasts to them as if they still had the hunger of boys. Out in the fields, it's spring, a coil, a season, a jump. I laugh about all the wrong words for things and wonder where mine will go to now. I clunk chipped plates on the table and dish up our meal. Boat-shaped birds are clumsy at mounting chairs, but once they're up, they don't tip. Tonight we eat flowers. Tomorrow we'll have moss. The next day I'll serve up leaf mulch or frozen water. Everything tastes vivid. Now I can no longer describe it. I could eat the world whole. My swan brothers slide stamens and leaves and bulbs into their bills, wetly swallowing. Their coal-lined eyes watch my red-painted lips as we taste petal flavors, yellow, white. I'm stronger, now no words are forced, strong as a swan. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And now it's time for the Q&A. So does anyone on the line or here have any questions?
And then Dagmara, do you want to talk about?
Hi, so we, through complete accident, we found ourselves at this gathering, our pieces are together, but we actually studied together as well. And just as Vanessa started as a graphic designer and ended up as a textile embroidery storyteller, I studied glass, and in Angela Carter's spirit, I totally subverted my own practice by ending up working with discarded, thrown away domestic objects, and kind of embellish them very much like Angela Carter's stories, with kind of rococo-like, slightly kitschy and slightly gothic-y, and totally over-the-top soft textile table materials. So this particular piece is made out of lampshades. It's a little bit like storytelling in a sense that there's a sequence of forms and they grow, and it could be also seen as a representation of Carteresque female characters who grow in strength from almost kind of cell-like objects that become much more self-aware in their femininity and sexuality. Finally, kind of apexing, so achieving this exit, it's kind of like a the embrace nature, a little bit, I would say, away from the earliest notion we had by speakers about Angela Carter not seeing female and nature as one. I kind of disagree. My interpretation is that she's actually really containing or the kind of fertile and feral in some way nature. So that's meant to be this kind of like a hymn and praise to a female child who becomes a grown-up female in her kind of strength and wilderness, with a little bit of still acknowledgement of this domestic interior, this where she could be seen as an object, but kind of subverting and releasing herself from it, and yet still being kind of suspended in kind of luxurious interiors. that's the summary of it.
Thank you.
I've created a vintage a tablecloth which represents the characters from Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber. I chose a tablecloth because the background of my research is founded in domesticity and feminism and femininity and ideas of the expectations that are placed upon women. So it's vintage tablecloth that I got secondhand. I don't know who originally stitched the flowers upon it, but I like the idea that I was working back on top of that, and also using it as a means of telling another story, because I think there are real links when you're stitching things about telling stories, and that's something that I often play around with. The reason for choosing to create a dinner party, one of the reasons was because of Judy Chicago's work, The Dinner Party, which was exhibited from the date from which The Bloody Chamber was published, which seemed to be a wonderful coincidence. And I liked how in Judy Chicago's work, she gave a place to the women, she made them important, she sort of heralded all of their achievements. And I think that in domesticity, that's something that's often lost. And so for this, I chose 4 of the characters from the book, and I've given them each as place setting. And then I chose objects that were referred to in the book. I was really, really interested in the way that Angela Carter was using objects as storytelling devices and the way that they behaved in her stories. So I decided just to have the objects. There are a few bits of text I played around with. For example, I've got Mrs. Bluebeard the Fourth, which meant I had to give them all name tags. And in that way, I've made a link between their associations with the men because they are Mrs. or whatever they might be, Mrs. Lion, Mrs. Tiger, Mrs. Bluebeard. Didn't quite work for the Countess, but I had to do the Lady of the House of Love. There were so many amazing objects in that. I couldn't really avoid doing that. So yeah, it's really just a way of telling the story with pictures, giving the women their place at the table, giving them that role of importance, and just exploring the way that Angela Carter was referencing objects in her storytelling.
Thank you, Vanessa. I'm sorry I made you do that twice. Right, I'll just switch cameras, and then Ben will take questions. Right, so Ben's mic is on again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, can you all hear me? Great. So does anyone have any questions for the writers and artists and Sarah? Yeah. Yeah, that's fine.
I had a question for Vanessa, if that's okay.
Hi.
So your tablecloth is beautiful.
Thank you.
Lovely stitch work. But I wanted to ask you, so in, I think 2014 maybe, or 2018, there was an exhibition on Hans Christian Andersen, and it was called You Must Be an Angel. And it was a long table with all of the characters from his fairy tales.
I did not know that existed, and now I have to go and find it.
Yes, I pulled up the link because I couldn't remember the title. But it was doing something quite interesting and quite similar, as in they picked specific objects or specific elements from the stories. And it was very tactile, so it was meant as a, I don't know what it's called, hands-on exhibition. You could touch everything. So for example, for The Little Mermaid, they had sort of sharp edges of the chair, but water was flowing all over so that you could get your hands in the water. And your tablecloth reminds me a lot of that. And I wondered if there is a tactile element to the fact that you used stitching, or if that's just your craft.
I really like the tactile element of the stitching. Like I said, thank you. My background's graphic design, and one of the reasons I don't do that anymore is because I can't stand just sitting looking at a screen and simply just moving a mouse around. Shall I move? I'm going to stay here. It's getting complicated. Here. Okay. We're working it out. Oh yes, you can see me now then. I can see that. Okay. All right. Yes, thank you for that exhibition reference. I have got to look at that. I did not know it existed, and it sounds absolutely amazing. You're asking about the tactility. In terms of the making, yes, absolutely. I love to make with my hands. It's something that I did since I was really small, and it wasn't actually until I was doing the same master's course as Dagmara, which we did, I think, about 10 years ago now, that I was able to translate what had become my digital design practice, which is how I earned a living at that point in time, and into something tactile. So in terms of the making process, yeah, that's absolutely fundamental to it. And also the process of slow stitching like that. So it takes, I mean, that's so many hours of work which have been done around work. So I do it on the train when I'm commuting. I do it when I'm waiting for the dinner to cook. I do it watching TV in the evening. It's the only way I manage to do it. And I think that tactility actually helps keep me sane too. But again, it's another reference to the women's work that I mentioned too. So the idea that I'm making work around my life, which is the only way it happens. But I think that tactility and that connection is important.
Does anyone else have any questions? Just put your hand up if you're online. Yeah. Are there any questions for?
I've got.
Yes.
I'm putting my camera on, but I've got a double chin because I've reverted to the sofa. There's just so much to absorb, from Sarah's keynote to all of the performances and the artwork, and I'm just trying to filter it all through, so I can't think of anything intelligent to say. But just in response to the artwork, I'm asking about the lampshade one, because they do look like corsets, and I'm not sure if that's intentional.
Just see myself.
Yeah.
Yes, it is intentional. Oh, yes. Okay. It's kind of intentional. I think that's. I don't know what came first, the corset or the lampshades, but they definitely look very, very similar and kind of make a little bit of a sinister aspect to it, that we hang lampshades and it becomes beautiful objects with a structure and a fabric stretch over it a little bit, as if the structure were woman ribs as well. So yes, I became quite conscious of it when I started kind of subverting these lampshades and putting them kind of upside down, so that they created almost like a body. There is certain morbidity about it, I think, about my lampshades, and I think that's again a little bit in a spirit of Angela Carter, and was great to see this lecture about this by Sarah Gamble, Dr. Sarah Gamble, about how female bodies are reassembled to become something that pleases the man. I'm trying to, I've played, toyed a little bit with this idea, but obviously wanted to make like anti-chandeliers type of things. So they kind of, they're to be pretty, but they're kind of quite angry. And just very quickly want to smuggle another few pieces which I brought with me, and they are kind of extension of lampshades, which are made from wire coat hangers. But they play with this idea of becoming wings, flapping rather in a kind of futile manner, but trying to lift off and fly. There were a lot of references of women turning to birds or bird-like creatures, and it's obviously a lot kind of there's this whole tradition of transformation into animals, birds in particular. And this one is made partially from recycled or found vintage lace and underwear, but also these beastly gloves. So it's this reference of tiger woman, of a woman becoming a beast, and also this duality of our half god, half monster, half creature type of theme. Thank you.
Yes, and yes. Does anyone else have any more questions for either the speakers on line or the speakers in person? Yeah. Naomi, hi.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. I've got a question for Heidi. So, you had it was such a powerful performance, and, following on from Sarah's talk, the fact that you were giving us this linguistic and narrative bricolage was very resonant, and, you were working, moving between the theory and the folktale and autobiography or seeming autobiography. It seems like you're traversing this realm of trauma. And I just wondered, in what capacities do you work as a storyteller? Where are you taking this? Because it just feels like it's really powerful, healing work. And I just would like to hear more about your career.
Thank you for the question. Well, I live in Norway, and we have a touring system in Norway when it comes to cultural or performances, which I do. And this is, of course, a performance for adults. So I perform this for adults, but I also do performance for children. And I mean, the biggest touring system in Norway is for children and youth. Yes, but it takes a long time to build up a performance. And then I get Arts Council support to make the performance. But I also work at the Oslo Metropolitan University, so I have some income next to the other things. Yeah. I don't know if that was the...
Do you do workshops? I just find it as a technique.
Yeah, I do workshops for storytellers, oral storytellers. Yes, absolutely. I'm very influenced by Paul Ricoeur and his way of looking at the mimesis, the term mimesis. So I build a lot around exploring what mimesis is in building up a performance where I combine different memories, sort of. Yes. Thank you for the question. Who are the it's you, Ben?
So, does anyone else have any more questions? Yes.
Question or an observation. I was just a couple of things about this one. It really looks to me like a balloon, a hot air balloon. with a basket at the bottom. I instantly... Yes, but I was also going to say there was a really interesting exhibition at the Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which I'm just managed to get to. It was just before the lockdown. Jacinta somebody.
Sorry, Dagmara, that microphone needs to be that microphone.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say the artist was Jacinta somebody, and again, it reminded me does that ring a bell with you?
Yes, I'm familiar with the work.
Yes, it reminded me very much of one of her.
I'm a great admirer of her work. Her son is sculpted by Joana Vasconcelos. It's a textile amazing sculptor from Portugal. Yeah, I haven't had the pleasure to see her work in Yorkshire Park.
And then Lorenzo, you had a question?
Yes. It's a question and a comment for Sarah. Hello, Sarah. Thank you very much for your paper, which was wonderful, I think, because you really highlighted the relationship between Angela Carter's work and art, the visual arts, and how we can read literature and philosophy to an extent through the lens of the visual arts. So my question is, you've shown you have located, if you like, your reading of aspects of Angela Carter's thought through the lens of contemporary art. But I was wondering whether she was interested, or she had a connection with the early modern world and the way in which art in the early modern period deconstructed human nature and the female body as well. And I'm thinking about, painters like the Garden of the Earthly Delights, Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch. And the second one is more a comment than a question, and I would like to share my thoughts with you and with you all. And the second one is related to your interpretation of anatomical art, and how anatomical art, at least within a 19th century context, in a way decontextualized in a derogatory way the female body. But if we go back in time a little bit, anatomical art was a way through which scientists and artists discovered more about the female body. And anatomical art, I'm thinking about, for instance, about Leonardo da Vinci and his sketches and his studies of the female body, and how those sketches helped the scientific milieu in the early modern period and the scientific milieu later on in European history, in Western history, to know more about the function and the wonders of the female body, not through the lens of philosophy or religion, but through empiricism, so empirical observation of the human body. So perhaps, and also from the early modern period onwards, anatomical painting also depicted the male body as much as the female body. So I'm thinking about Rembrandt's and the lesson of Dr. Tulip, for example. So I was wondering to know what you think about this. Thank you.
Well, I think we have to draw a line between anatomical art and romantic art. In the sense that, I mean, the anatomical Venus is something I'm really interested in, but she didn't make it into the paper, unfortunately, because I'm very interested in the image of the anatomical Venus. But I think there's a world of difference between something like the anatomical Venus and paintings that are done in the spirit of inquiry in order to learn more about the workings of the body, and the kind of 19th century romantic images that I showed in the paper. Because the women on anatomist tables, that has absolutely nothing to do with saying anything about anatomy, and everything to do with romanticizing the dead female body, the beautiful dead female body. So I think that you can draw a line between the two. You've got art that absolutely exists as a way of learning about the operations of the body, and those works are as likely to feature men as they are women. But when you come to the 19th century and the pre-Raphaelites and that whole school that feature red-headed doomed ladies, then I think you're moving into another realm. These paintings of women on the anatomist table have nothing to do with anatomy and everything to do with being able to look at a naked, beautiful body. So, and as for the early modern comment, I mean, Carter she wrote a review of artists of the Tudor court, or the and she of course, as a medievalist, she would have been aware of medieval art conventions. So I think she's far more conversant with the history of art than we tend to think. We haven't really looked into the extent to which she was knowledgeable about art of all periods. I mean, we know that she was like I say, she was a bricoleur. She collected all kinds of information from all kinds of places. But we also know, particularly from Edmund Gordon's biography, that she considered a career in art. She considered going to art school rather than university. And if you look at, I don't know if you've seen her wonderful, wonderful notebooks, but they are as much art objects as they are records of her work. And in between the pages, you find collages, you find postcards, you find things cut out, images cut out of magazines. Often, and I'm quite interested in this with the poetry in particular, you often see a picture next to a draft of a poem. Her poetry was often inspired directly by visual art. So she's incredibly knowledgeable about art across periods, I think, because she did at the beginning, like she thought about becoming a poet, she also considered becoming an artist, and she did produce her own artwork. I mean, it was never for public consumption, but she was an enthusiastic amateur artist herself. And this is what I'm interested in exploring, is the extent to which her work is informed, not just by what she has read or the films she has seen, but the pictures that she's viewed and her knowledge of art practice and art history. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yes, thank you.
So now, sorry, Ben, I will take over.
Does anyone else have? Oh, Michelle, you have a question.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
It's all right. So I have a question. It's actually for Brenda and Jess. You've probably heard that Ali Smith, the British writer Ali Smith, she once said that she would not be writing the way she does today if it weren't for Angela Carter. And I wanted to know if you would agree with that. And if so, sorry, I have my cat here. She's trying to participate in the conversation. She's very enthusiastic. Would you agree with that? And if so, in what ways do you feel that her writing sort of opened up possibilities for you, whether it be on the formal level or thematic level or in questions of atmosphere or Gothic? So it's a very open-ended question. You can do with it what you like.
Shall I jump in or? Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question. That's a really interesting question. I was in a really strange position, which was I'd written my first debut novel, Snake Ropes, and it had just come out, and everyone was being very lovely and talking about it and in various ways. And there were so many references by people to Angela Carter in terms of the content and the style of the novel. I was fascinated by this because at that point in time, I will hang my head, I hadn't actually read Angela Carter's writing. Of course, I rectified that immediately and read as much as I possibly could. And I could see what people meant. And it was to do with the kind of fairy tale content and the experimentation with language and all sorts of things. There were many, many parallels. And it was almost like one of these kind of spooky coincidences for me, in that I wrote my novel and then I discovered Angela Carter, which I should have known about all along. I should have been, immersed in her work throughout, I'm sure. And I'm sure it would have, changed how I wrote my first novel. But it was actually quite blissful coming to her late as well, because that meant that I could really enjoy it from the point of view as a writer and not just as a reader. So coming to Angela Carter late in life was wonderful for me, because once I'd written my own novel, I could really, really see what she was doing in terms of her writing in a way that had a lot more depth. And if I'd just come to her as a young woman reading it, I would have come from a different angle. And I'm really intrigued by that. And I guess where I now look at the similarity is to do with the experimentation with language, with tenses, and the freedom to do that. And I guess now she does influence me. So yeah, thank you for your question.
I think I would say that in a way, my experience with the text of Angela Carter has really been a pathway of liberation within my own life. Her themes, her subversion of patriarchal text and stories that we've all have grown up with, the way that she turns these on their head, her own personal story, her narrative of her education, of her writing process, the way that she gathers in stories and investigates and is interested in everything around her, definitely inspires me. Especially, I write in dark fiction, poetically, and in fictional tropes, and it's a very difficult world to be a female in. You're confronted with males writing about the female body in a particular way, and often women in dark fiction often write underneath pseudonyms and in shadowy places and aren't kind of coming out into the light. And I find Angela Carter, her ability to do this and do it so bravely, just inspires my writing just daily. Sometimes when I get stuck, I'm like, oh, what would Angela Carter do with this? Or I might dive back into her works to work out problems within my own fictions that I'm writing. And I just thank everyone that was speaking. I'm just so inspired by everything I've heard today. Just so inspired. It's just been a really wonderful early morning for me too. Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? I have one. This is for Heidi, Brenda, and Jess. With fairy tale tellings, how do you decide which parts of the tale to adapt and which parts of the tale to reject?
That was for Jess and Heidi
and Brenda.
Is that okay? Who would like to go?
I can go first.
Thanks, Jess.
Cool. Yeah, it's a really good question, Ben. Thank you. In terms of retelling fairy tales, I guess some writers want to be very loyal to the various versions because there are always many versions of fairy tales. So it's kind of like looking through where do you start? How far back do you go? Obviously these are all from oral tradition. They're from all over the world. There are some very strange, spooky coincidences about where fairy tales might come from and how they travel. How they traveled before they were written down as well. So I guess with me, when it comes to looking at fairy tales, I'm kind of inspired by Angela Carter's kind of idea of them extracting the latent content from them in some way. With her, she said the latent content is violently sexual, and that was where her interest took her in fairy tales, or her kind of understanding of them. With me, I guess I'm not so much retelling a lot of the time. It's more taking some of that latent content that I see from my own perspective, something that might be relevant to my own life. So using that kind of personal lived experience. So for example, with the Swan sister, I was really interested in her relationship to silence because I have an interesting relationship to silence. So kind of like really exploring how a silent sister might function around her transformed brothers. So I guess it's choosing something within it that speaks to my own lived experience in some way. Although there are other ones where it's been something else, like for example, the Emperor's New Clothes. I wrote a version of that where the Emperor in my version is skinned by his wife and he becomes her new clothes. So she wears his skin at the end of the story. And again, that's kind of set in quite a contemporary time and draws on contemporary texts as well. So experiments with language in particular ways. So I guess my answer is, looking for that latent content, but also looking for what's current, what's relevant, what seems urgent in some way. And that could be personal, or it could be about politics and what's going on in the world around. So yeah, all kinds of things can happen in that kind of creative space.
Heidi or Brenda, do you want to answer next? Yeah, Heidi, come through.
Thank you for a question. I think it's quite similar to what that Jess said. I work also with a lot of variations of a folktale. And of course, I usually have a topic which I'm researching, and then there's some motives in the folktale that is not corresponding to the topic I'm researching. Also, I work with folktales, so I don't know how you separate fairy tales from folk tales, but in folk tales you have motifs which are cultural, not actual anymore, which I easily remove, and I also do not write. I only work orally with stories. So it is also based on what I remember. Thank you. Brenda?
When I go in to tackle one of these stories, I kind of worked backwards. So I went back from the more modernized or like King James version of a story for this one in particular, and went backwards because power is within words. And so some of the old Hebrew words made more sense to use in the way that I did. And also when I'm looking for stories, and I'm looking for who's been silenced, how has the power been taken away from particular characters within texts that have, traveled, in this case, thousands of years. And so who has been silenced, and why have they been silenced throughout all of the different editions and versions of biblical or Jewish text? And then I try to envision what their words would be, and or how their actions can be subverted for a more female or feminist retelling. Yeah, I don't know how else more to explain that one, but that's how I go about it.
So you have a question?
Alex, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me now? Am I okay?
Yes.
Hi Ben, how are you?
I'm good. What's your question?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, it's been really amazing and it's very engaging and it's incredibly interesting. So thank you for organising it, everyone. It wasn't necessarily a question, but I just wanted to ask, well, kind of, Jess, with your book, when everyone was remarking on how it related to Angela Carter, was there a particular story that you gravitated to after you'd written it, or was there a particular story that people were relating it to before you had even read Carter?
Hi, thanks. That's a great question. No, there wasn't. I think it was just more to do with the style and the kind of fairy tale and the story within the story, and the kind of elements of folkloric text, the kind of issues of violence, the clear feminism, and yeah, it was also written in an invented dialect, so it was clear from the outset, I think, that I was kind of really interested in experimentation with language. So there was, I think it was more a whole combination of elements all thrown in a debut novel that people were kind of seeing kind of correlations there. When I first grabbed the first Angela Carter book that came to hand, it was Wise Children, and I also listened to it on audiobook, and it was actually wonderful to hear it spoken as well. And that made me kind of think a lot about this difference between oral and written storytelling, and it's been great to hear a bit more about that today. This kind of idea of folklore versus fairy tale, or folklore leading to or feeding into fairy tale, and the way that all of these stories cross over and travel and come to us in various ways. And I think with Angela Carter, it's just the Wise Children one was brilliant to read that one, and to look at the relationships between female characters as well, because that was something that was really significant in my debut novel Snake Ropes, and then became more significant again in Cooking with Bones, where I've got two sisters. So there you can see the influence coming in, I think, of the siblings and what's going on with their complex relationship.
Got you. Oh, Thank you. Also, it was your artwork, wasn't it, with the books?
Yes.
Yeah, that was amazing. I loved the way you blocked it out with white. It almost looks like Tipex, and you had clouds, and then the fact that you had the same color for the pages of the book as a tree stretching up into the sky. I thought that was so clever, because obviously books come from trees, and I just thought that was really great because I love artwork. So.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was those books are part of my PhD project. They've kind of culminated in, I think at the moment there's 17 of them. I'm probably make some more anyway, just because I love making them. But it's a form of retelling, I guess, another way of retelling stories. And there are many people that do kind of blackout or whiteout poetry. But what I'm doing is I'm doing whiteouts and artworks with whole books. So I'm kind of rewriting them or retelling them, or redacting them, or censoring them even, or plagiarizing them in some ways. So there's a lot of ways of looking at working with existing books. But yeah, I made a suitcase full of 17 transformed books, which are designed to kind of produce a kind of unique performative reading experience, because all the texts are layered. And what you can't really see on the screen is that there's half redactions as well. So some of the words are left semi-visible in the books. So they kind of come through as what I've been calling textual whispers. I'm kind of desperate to exhibit them in the UK as well, but at the moment they're in New Zealand with me and no one is traveling. So yeah, I'd love to kind of show them, but they're kind of best viewed in silence, one-to-one, one person with a suitcase of books and an unlimited amount of time to just sit with them and read them quietly.
No, it's great. Obviously, because poetry as well, you said you write poetry, you read between the lines of poetry, of course. So if you can see the words, you can semi-see them, which is obviously great because it links with poetry. So people to get that, of course, if they've studied literature anyway. So great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for your question.
That was a really good discussion, and thanks Ben for chairing, but I'm going to wrap it up because we need a 15-minute